Good afternoon and welcome to Innovative Partnerships for Affordable Housing, working together to respond, stabilize, and recover. I'm Flora Arabu, National Senior Director for State and Local Policy at Enterprise Community Partners. Enterprise is a national nonprofit with 40 years of experience in addressing America's affordable housing crisis from every angle. We develop and deploy programs, advocate for bipartisan housing policies at every level of government, invest capital to build and preserve affordable rental homes, and we own and operate 13,000 affordable homes and provide resident services for 22,000 people. Also, that people not only make the rent, they build futures. It's my pleasure to now introduce our Chief Executive Officer and President, Priscilla Almodovar. In her role, Priscilla is building on the strength and breadth of Enterprise's work nationwide. Under her leadership, we recently launched our 5-year strategic plan, sharpening our focus on increasing housing supply, advancing racial equity, and building resilience and upward mobility. Priscilla, I'll turn it over to you.
Thank you, Flora, and thank you everyone for joining us here today. We have over 2,500 registrants for today's event, hailing from 49 states, the District of Columbia, Puerto Rico, the US Virgin Islands, and the American Samoa. So really, thank you everyone for joining us. You know, this is a critical moment for our country, especially for those of us working in housing and community development. We're beginning to emerge from a pandemic that has taken thousands of lives and millions of livelihoods. Last month marked the 1-year anniversary of George Floyd's killing and the powerful widespread calls for racial justice. And we're only just beginning to rebuild from an economic recession that has hit communities of color the hardest. We have an opportunity now to make changes that strengthen our communities so that everyone has a fair shot at success. You know, so much of this is housing. When people and families have safe, stable, affordable places and resilient places to live, they can withstand financial shocks like the loss of a job, an increase in medical bills. They also find it easier to stay healthier, pursue an education, maybe a job promotion, and they help build local economies. And you know that racial justice and housing are so connected. The communities we live in today and the segregation that exists across the country were shaped by policies like redlining. And we know that home ownership is at the core of this country's racial wealth gap. These are big generational problems, and the only way that we can solve them together is through powerful partnerships. We need to bring everyone to the table: governments, nonprofits, private companies, and the people whose lived experience should be there to lead us forward. That's what our work at Enterprise is all about: creating and strengthening partnerships, and why we are so delighted that you're with us here today. Now, we're going to hear from a fantastic panel in just a few minutes, but first, we're going to share a video message from Secretary Marcia Fudge of the US Department of Housing and Urban Development. Due to a change in her travel schedule, Secretary Fudge cannot be with us here today. However, she didn't send just one, but 3 members of her senior team to join us in today's conversation. So we're so glad to welcome Arthur Jemison from the Office of Community Planning and Development, Dominique Blum from the Office of Public and Indian Housing, and Peggy Bailey from the Office of the Secretary. So with that, let's cue up the video.
Thanks to the leadership of Enterprise Community Partners for inviting me to join this important conversation. I thank President and CEO Priscilla Almodovar and Jacqueline Waggoner, the President of Enterprise's Solutions Division. Special thanks to all the mayors and local leaders speaking at today's webinar for sharing their strategies and insights for addressing America's affordable housing crisis. Thanks as well to everyone tuning in today for all you do to help expand housing opportunity, to build stronger and more resilient communities, and to advance racial equity in our nation. Your work is especially vital as America continues to rebuild from the COVID-19 pandemic. I am proud to work in an administration that puts strengthening security and stability for those in greatest need at the core of its mission. As a result of President Joe Biden's visionary leadership in passing the American Rescue Plan, HUD is now helping to deliver $5 billion in emergency rental assistance for people experiencing homeless or who are at risk of experiencing homeless. This funding will empower local leaders to offer support to roughly 200,000 households. The Biden-Harris administration recognizes that helping families weather the pandemic is only one part of the task before us. Moving forward, we have the added responsibility and the great opportunity to take bold action to expand our nation's supply of affordable housing. That is why the President has issued the American Jobs Plan, a once-in-a-generation investment in our nation's infrastructure, including our housing infrastructure. The plan invests $318 billion to build, restore, and modernize more than 2 million affordable and sustainable places to live. It includes a new federal tax credit based on the proposed Neighborhood Homes Investment Act. This credit can help lead to the construction and renovation of approximately 500,000 homes for buyers of more modest means. In addition, by dramatically expanding support for initiatives such as the Low-Income Housing Tax Credit, the Jobs Plan could spur the construction of as many as 600,000 affordable apartments during the next 5 years. The President understands we can only advance housing opportunity by centering our efforts around the guiding principles of fairness and equity. We know people of color still face discrimination in our housing market when trying to rent homes, to secure mortgages, and to move into neighborhoods with greater opportunity. That is why, as Secretary, I will make enforcing our fair housing laws a priority. I am proud to lead a new White House initiative charged with addressing discrimination in our appraisal market. This effort, which will bring together partners from across the federal government, is the first such initiative in the history of our country. In addition, I am happy to report that HUD has published a new interim rule regarding AFFH, and I look forward to continuing our work to finally realize the full promise of the 1968 Fair Housing Act. In the weeks and months ahead, HUD will continue to stand as your ally and advocate in helping to provide every American with the chance to live with security, with dignity, and with hope. I look forward to partnering with all of you, and I cannot wait to see all the great work we will accomplish together. Thank you very much and have a wonderful event.
I want to thank the Secretary for her remarks. It is so exciting to hear that the administration is focused on racial equity and expanding resources for the people who need them most. I'm also inspired to hear more about the explicit commitment to affirmatively further fair housing and to realize the promise of the Fair Housing Act. It's a critical piece of work to advance racial equity and housing, and we look forward to continuing this important work together. Now, I'd like to introduce our panel, starting with the moderator, my awesome colleague, Jacqueline Waggoner, who is the president of our Solutions Division, and she leads the policy and programmatic work across enterprise. We have a powerful cross-section of local, state, native, and national leaders with her here today. Please join me in welcoming Mayor Lori Lightfoot of Chicago, Mayor Michael Hancock of Denver, Mayor Robyn Tannehill of Oxford, Mississippi, Chairwoman Robyn Danner of the Sovereign Council of Hawaiian Homestead Associations, Deputy Mayor Ramirez of Los Angeles, and of course, the representatives from the Office of Housing and Urban Development that I introduced earlier, Arthur Jemison, Dominique Blum, and Peggy Bailey. With that, I would share their bios. They all have great accomplishments. I encourage you to go on our website, see their bios, and turn it over to Jacqueline just to get us started. So Jacqueline, I turn it over to you.
Well, thank you so much, Priscilla. Hello and welcome, everyone. It's a special honor for me to be here today, speaking with such a diverse and bold group of leaders. I'm very anxious to hear all of their perspectives, and I'm sure our audience is too, so let's just dive in. Mayor Lightfoot, I'd like to start with you if that's okay. Can you talk to us about some of the housing challenges that are unique to Chicago and ways in which the administration is working with the federal government and innovating locally to meet the needs of your residents with racial equity at the forefront?
Well, thank you, Dr. Waggoner, and thanks to all of you for pulling this important discussion together. Let me zero in on one challenge that we face, and it's actually in the footprint of the Obama Presidential Center, which we are looking forward to breaking ground on this fall. What we saw immediately when the location for the center was announced was an incredible land speculation. And in the footprint of the center, it's a majority Black neighborhood, low income, with a lot of long-term renters, but also long-term homeowners who are finding challenges being able to stay in their community, and certainly were being tempted by land speculators. I have to credit our great Commissioner of Housing, along with our policy director in my office, and we came up with a very specific solution, working with local stakeholders. And the long and the short of it is, we put together a $10 million package designed to help support long-term homeowners, make the necessary renovations and repairs in their home. We also put some specific heightened restrictions on affordable housing developments to make sure that renters were also protected. And it's really in line with the work that we're doing to support the Obama Presidential Center by investing in neighborhoods on the south and the west sides of our city to make sure that those neighborhoods and long-term residents aren't displaced by the changing demographics and economic fortunes of this neighborhood as a result of the investments being made in a presidential center. This was not easy work. It really required us to roll up our sleeves, deal with a very skeptical and fearful group of residents and activists, but we got it done because we knew it was the right thing to do. We focused like a laser beam, and we work with the community to overcome their fears and their skepticism. And this, I think, is going to be one of the great success stories in addressing long-term residents, not allowing gentrification to lead to displacement, and making sure that we're providing resources to support long-term residents, whether they are renters or homeowners.
Well, thank you so much, Mayor Lightfoot. I have family and friends that live in that area, so we really appreciate your leadership. And Enterprise is so excited to be working with you. This is a unique time in our nation's history, and you've done an outstanding job in addressing equity and inclusivity in the nation. And we'll be watching you as your work progresses. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Now let's hear from Chairwoman Danner of Sovereign Council of Hawaiian Homestead Associations. Chairwoman Danner, aloha.
Hi, everyone.
Yes, can you tell our audience about the Sovereign Council and the challenges you've overcome in serving the housing and land trust needs of homestead communities in Hawaii?
Well, aloha, everyone, honorable mayors, officials of HUD, leaders of Enterprise, and all that have joined us this morning. I'm really humbled to be here to hold space for my Native Hawaiian people here in the 50th state, and to say aloha mai to our tribal relatives across the country, the Chamorro and Guam, and of course, American Samoa, all indigenous peoples of the 50 states and the territories in the Pacific. My name is Robyn Puanani Danner, and as you said, the Shaw, I am the elected chairwoman, the first female elected chairwoman of the Sovereign Council, representing the interests of Native Hawaiians defined in a land trust law that was enacted by the US Congress in 1920, 100 years ago, actually, next month. There are 35 states in the country where trust lands were established by the United States for American Indians, for Alaska Natives and Native Hawaiians, very much like cities and counties, as well as state governments. Our work at the Shaw and Trust Lands is about implementing solutions to breathe life into our respective lands and thereby our citizens, our residents, our families, our businesses. I really want to thank Enterprise for hosting the conversation within the first 6 months of the Biden administration and with Secretary and her team, especially on innovations happening on the ground. And I do appreciate the inclusion of the perspectives of federally created trust lands, whether we call them homesteads out here in Hawaii, or reservations, or allotments, or land trusts, lands held into trust. Our communities, probably like our esteemed mayors, the pandemic revealed the resiliency of our communities when longstanding challenges were heightened to really crisis levels. Everything became compacted, everything became magnified, and federal partnerships, particularly with HUD, has become more and more valuable to get solutions to the ground. And I'd like to say on today's topic of innovations, one of the reasons they are even possible out here in community is stability and flexibility at the agency itself in how core programming is delivered, how resources are moved out of the agency to community, like CDBG or Section 4 or NAHASDA. Some of my favorite partnerships with HUD and our trust lands have been on the connective tissue between homeownership and economic development, connecting job creation to home loan qualifications. HUD helped us build a simple certified kitchen that led to an open air marketplace that led to business ownership and employment, which of course, stable employment is a cornerstone to home ownership. So HUD, the embrace, I think, of HUD in job creation within its housing program mission to create stronger rural economies has been key. Another partnership with HUD with momentum this year is with a tribal serving organization where I serve as vice chairman for the nonprofit Owista Corporation. For the first time in our history, an initiative is moving forward to establish the first national native HUD housing counseling intermediary, making sure that the unique aspects of our trust lands are indoctrinated in the vital work of financial literacy. It may not seem like an innovation, but when it's a resource and a reality that hasn't existed for our people, it certainly is. And still another HUD partnership moving under Section 4 programming, really worthy of note, is tackling culturally appropriate housing design instead of the many, many decades of assimilated housing models. It's a game changer to break free from the mindset of one house, one family, when the reality culturally is multifamily living as the norm, being highly valued. And we can do it and still stay within the framework of the 1 to 4 family conventional mortgage capital. And I'll close my remarks by saying that HUD has really great bones. With this administration just getting started, being so accessible, so much will happen when we are talking to each other and creating partnerships with communities and leaders. For example, perhaps a difficult issue to raise, forms of redlining are very much still present on our trust lands, and it's totally fixable, especially when all of our mortgages have a federal nexus or guarantee program attached to them. It doesn't have to take a generation. We can bring parity. We really can to our trust lands with an administration that knows redlining when it sees it. And I think we have that administration now. So mahalo for inviting me.
Well, thank you so much, Chairwoman Danner, and shout out to my HUD colleagues on the line. Chairman Danner is saying you guys are really doing your part to support cultural awareness and building programs and more to come. It's critically important that we lift up the housing needs of the nation's native inhabitants, from tribal nations and Native Hawaiians and Native Alaskans. And I really appreciate the perspective you bring to this discussion. Thank you, Chairwoman Danner. Now, let's turn it over to Denver. Mayor Hancock, Denver is a rapidly growing city that had already been rapidly changing before COVID arrived. Were there any elements in Denver's innovative housing and homelessness strategy that prepare you for responding to community needs throughout the pandemic? Mayor Hancock.
it's a real pleasure and honor to be with you and the entire panel here, and always good to see my fellow mayors from across the country, good friends, and to know that in common we have this challenge and opportunity, quite frankly, to address, I think, one of the most epic and challenging issues that any city or territory can focus on. You know, the reality is this: housing is not a traditional local function. We don't typically we typically defer that to the federal and state levels, but because of what's happened, we've over the last few, I would say 3 decades, local governments have had to lean in and really build a foundation of building, of really repairing the breach, if you will, and making sure that people have access to affordable, decent housing, and that their areas are protected. And I think we've heard some of the mayors and President Danner talk about this already. Let me share with you some of the things that we've done in Denver that helped us prepare for the pandemic. One, after taking office in 2011, in middle of 2011, early 2012, it became very apparent that as we emerged from the recession, we were in the midst of a housing crunch. That we was reverse of the catastrophe that hit us during the recession. And so we had to do a couple things, and we learned some valuable lessons. And what shook out of those lessons were, one, as a local government, we must lean in, and we must use tools and mechanisms, whether locally or with federal resources, to provide housing and to protect and preserve housing. And so we had to first raise knowledge and awareness of the histories and patterns of housing in Denver, and be honest about them. We have intentionally and unintentionally created gentrification and involuntary displacement in some communities. We had to acknowledge the real impacts of redlining and the rules that came about that kept some neighborhoods socially, economically challenged and deprived, while others were able to flourish and thrive. We had to have the attitude that we had to be thoughtful, good intentions of going in and investing in some neighborhoods, parks, attracting enterprises to certain areas might trigger gentrification and involuntary displacement. We had to be aware of those things. City governments are the first to know when someone's making an investment because they're filing permits and plans with you. And so we needed to move into action. And then so we decided to get innovative. One, we created our neighborhood equity stabilization division, which would notify neighbors that certain things are happening, but move in with tools and mechanisms to protect them if investments were occurring, and help us to identify who would be most vulnerable. We call that effort our NEST, Neighborhood Equity Stabilization Team. And then we created some other innovative programs and started by using the tools we already have. We were making a fortune in marijuana retail sales in Denver. And so we sliced off 2% of those revenues and started to invest in affordable housing. We not only invested in affordable housing that has now resulted in 2,600 units of affordable housing being built, but we also created a program called TRUA, T-R-U-A, which stands for Temporary Rental Utility Assistance Program, that helps to keep people in their housing when they have a problem. I may just be in between jobs. I may have had a medical condition or situation where I can't make my rent today or this month. And so TRUA provides for temporary relief as well as with your utilities. And then we created a homeless resolution effort, a host team, a Department of Housing Stability. And this team went about the process of formulating our housing strategies and our approach to people who didn't have housing and needed shelter, all the way to folks who were trying to preserve and stay in housing. Out of that came a tax initiative where a 0.25% sales tax was passed in Denver. We call it our Homeless Resolution Fund, and it helps us to provide housing for those who are shelter and support programs for those who are without shelter and need housing and need support as members of our community who happen to be homeless. It was this framework, Dr. Waggoner, that helped us to really move in and help those during the pandemic. We had the team already set up. We had resources that were flowing in. We were able to provide over 1,000 hotels for people who were unsheltered in our community. We were able to, because we had to shorten distance or do social distancing in the shelters, we had to provide other shelters services in the city. So we opened up a old arena in the city of Denver in our Western Center that provided 700-800 people cots a night for people who were without shelter. It was the foundation of building this awareness and building the programs and support services along the way prior to the pandemic that allowed us to respond as quickly as we did and to make sure we were able to help those who were unsheltered in our community during a very, very difficult and challenging time in all of our lives.
Well, thank you for that, Mayor Hancock. Great work, great innovation happening under your leadership for those who that need housing stability, to those that are unsheltered. You are bringing and delivering great solutions. And as the HUD Secretary shared, like affirmatively furthering fair housing, as you think about redlining, there's some opportunities for improvement, and we're on that track. So thank you. And I want to thank you for working with our market leader, Jenny Rogers. She's so pleased to have the opportunity to work with you and your team. So thank you so much for sharing your insights. Up next, I'd like to ask Mayor Tannehill to offer a different perspective on the topic. Oxford, Mississippi. This is a small town of 27,000 people. Although I live in Los Angeles, I spent my summers in my family's hometown in East Texas with a population of 5,600. So I've seen firsthand how small towns operate. How are jurisdictions like yours responding to the housing crunch in light of limited resources? And what our small towns need? And what could the federal government be doing to help you scale solutions?
Well, thank you very much for that question, Jacqueline. I am honored to be included in this discussion with such amazing leaders, and I very much appreciate the opportunity for small towns across America, excuse me, to have a seat at the table. The challenges that we've heard from Mayors Lightfoot and Hancock are some of the same challenges that we face in Oxford, Mississippi, a college town of 27,000 full-time residents that swells to 50,000 with students and workforce on most days and exceeds 200,000 on an SEC home football weekend. I say often that Oxford is a small town with big city problems. The physical vastness and cultural diversity of the United States can make the country seem more inherently different than it is similar. But what's broadly true of America in rural and urban areas alike is the persistent shortage of affordable housing. Oxford, with a permanent population of just 27,000, currently has housing costs which are on par with the city of Milwaukee. Oxford is a victim of its own success in many ways, and that shows up glaringly in our real estate prices. Over the years, people have decided that they want the charm of a small town without having to sacrifice hip restaurants, cool coffee shops, and lively streets of a bigger city. And that's when Oxford's affordability began to fade. You know, this has been good for business. More hotels and new restaurants means more jobs. But now our hometown is facing the same issues facing urban centers around the world. Our goal is to foster smart growth in the city without pushing workforce to the fringes. However, as much as we want this solution, our next problem is that we lack the resources locally to accomplish it. Small towns in America operate on highly limited budgets, and creating new housing is a luxury that we simply don't have. Finally, and in summary, we don't have enough roofs for our workforce, for our disabled persons, and for others on fixed incomes to live inside our city limits. But we've been trying, and please allow me to brag just a little bit about some of our successes. 5 years ago, Oxford's largest affordable housing development was in total disrepair. And the massive cuts by the prior administration put us in a losing situation. Faced with 96 families who were on the verge of having no home, we made affordable housing a top priority for our city. Through a grassroots effort, we found replacement homes for all 96 families using their Section 8 vouchers. But even after this, we realized we'd really only averted a crisis, and we needed to do far more to provide high quality housing to persons in lower income levels. So we've made huge strides by employing three main strategies. First, we established affordable housing as a top priority for the city, above almost every other need. We communicated the urgency and formed a City Affordable Housing Commission, hosted a community-wide affordable housing summit, and we engaged stakeholders from every sector to tackle the problem together. Affordable housing is solved in many communities by officials simply brushing it under the rug, sadly, with the implicit hope that those people will just go somewhere else. Well, we rejected this, and we addressed not only our need for affordable housing, but for our desire to have it in our community. Second, we reshaped our city ordinances to maximize the chances that private developers could realistically be successful in using housing tax credits to build in Oxford. We created an affordable housing incentive ordinance, which gave waivers and other incentives to developers if they would serve lower income residents. It passed unanimously and it was used instantly. As a result, we are currently about to open the third phase of almost 200 new tax credit homes in Oxford. This is over $23 million in affordable housing development with zero direct cost to our local government. Thirdly, we annexed more land to give the space for affordable housing to be developed. Though through thoughtful planning, we were able to almost double our land area, and we only added about 3,000 residents in those annexed areas. And this undeveloped land is now fertile ground for growth. We are extremely proud of our successes, but we want and need to be able to do much more in the area of housing. While metropolises like Chicago and LA make up a huge portion of America's population, small and suburban towns in America collectively contain far more Americans, but we often lack the ability to get the attention of the federal government like a large city can. Put simply, 70% of Americans don't live in large cities. So, Secretary Fudge and HUD team, my hope for your work is that smaller towns will not be forgotten, that we will be invited to help shape our futures together. And this is a first step. And we're so appreciative. While the affordability challenges in urban and rural areas impact a similar percentage of the population, the federal response to the crisis differs considerably, and it should. The solution for Mayor Lightfoot is going to differ drastically from the solutions that are needed in Oxford, Mississippi. Oxford has a robust community dedicated to your mission. Our measure of return on investment is roofs over heads. And we have made up a lot of ground with extremely limited resources. But we hope that with your leadership, we can expand this model and help not just Oxford, but every struggling small town in America. Thank you.
Wow. Thank you, Mayor Tannehill. Small town, big voice, leading the way, prioritizing affordable housing. Exciting to hear about 300 more units and what you're doing to engage stakeholders. Cheers to you. We see you, we hear you. And it's good to get the rural perspective into the conversation. Now, what we're going to move to is where I'm located now. I'd like to move to Deputy Mayor Ramirez. As an Angelino myself, I've heard and seen firsthand how the housing crisis, COVID-19, and homelessness have impacted Los Angeles, particularly from a racial equity perspective. Can you tell us about how the COVID-19 pandemic affected the city's efforts around housing and homelessness, and what lessons have been learned going forward?
Well, thank you, Jacqueline. We appreciate all the work you and your team have done here in LA, and it's an honor to be here and share some insights from our great city on behalf of Mayor Garcetti. What a blessing to find ourselves in safer times and to have a voice at the table to lead efforts across this nation to rebuild and recover. I appreciate the question because I'm constantly reflecting through the equity lens when I think about the impacts of this pandemic, thinking about who's been impacted the most, what we will do to help those communities heal and recover, and also just as important, who is at the table to be a part of these conversations for our communities. I've worked for about 20 years across the state from the Bay to LA, serving our most vulnerable communities on the ground. Nothing gives me more perspective than the lived experience I bring to the table. As a person of color, as a son of immigrants, and as someone who personally experienced homelessness growing up. Our voices matter, and if there's any lessons learned from this pandemic, it's that leadership truly matters. From Mayor Garcetti to Governor Newsom, to the Biden administration, to everyone here, leadership has been critical to this moment and where we go moving forward. When the pandemic first hit, our city rose to the challenge, quickly deploying resources and expanding our existing efforts to keep people housed and to move our unhoused neighbors indoors like never before. Leveraging FEMA reimbursement and state dollars, we moved over 8,000 people off the streets and into temporary hotel shelters through Project Roomkeep. The majority of guests of which have now transitioned into either permanent housing or more stable interim housing solutions, making it our most successful interim housing model to date. We also continue to develop and open Bridge Home temporary shelters, which are constructed on city-owned land. During the pandemic, we opened 20 of the current 28 sites, bringing more than 2,000 beds online for our unhoused community. Homelessness prevention is and will be key to stopping the inflow of homelessness. We were the first city in the nation to enact an eviction moratorium that is still in place. We froze rent increases on all 624,000 of our rent-stabilized units. And we also allocated more than $10 million to fund a comprehensive local eviction defense program. In addition, we used CARES Act funds to run the largest emergency rental assistance program in the country. Today, we've distributed over $200 million in direct assistance to Angelenos to pay for rent, utilities, and the basic necessities. We're distributing an additional $235 million through our rental assistance program, and more funds are on the way through the American Rescue Plan. Together, this will represent more than $700 million in direct assistance to Angelenos when they need it the most. This model of direct assistance works and is a critical tool for promoting racial equity. As part of Mayor Garcetti's recently signed justice budget, we will continue this approach into the future with a guaranteed basic income pilot for 2,000 households. When it came to permanent housing solutions, we also combined city, state, and federal dollars as part of Project Homestead to purchase 20 properties that will soon be converted into permanent housing. Our affordable and permanent supportive housing projects, which use local Proposition HHH funds, also continued construction throughout the pandemic. Since 2020, 21 projects with more than 1,300 units have completed construction and are leased up. All these efforts have reinforced that the only long-term solution to homelessness is permanent and affordable housing. And we want to continue to build off these successes. As we prioritize and expedite our work to build permanent affordable housing, we're actively looking to acquire even more properties. But in addition to capital funding, operating subsidies are a crucial part of permanent supportive housing development. The properties purchased through Project Homestead, for example, only 20% were able to immediately convert to permanent housing. The remainder still need to be rehabbed and require additional operational support to convert from interim to permanent housing. Furthermore, of the more than 10,000 properties in our affordable and supportive housing pipeline, at least a fifth lack the operating subsidies to move forward. We expect that the subsidy gap will even widen even more with continued acquisition and development. Now, we all know that housing is a solution to homelessness, and I want to express our tremendous appreciation for the Biden administration's commitment to housing as demonstrated in the 2022 budget proposal. Specifically, I want to call out the proposals to add 200,000 housing choice vouchers, the 37% increase in home funding, and the nearly 10% increase in CDBG funding. Due to historic and present day injustices, we know that communities of color in our city disproportionately face homelessness and housing insecurity. These federal investments will go a long way towards supporting our efforts in Los Angeles to promote an equitable recovery. As the administration works to make vouchers universal and reform the Housing Choice Voucher Program, I urge HUD to consider project-based vouchers as part of that toolkit, potentially having a needs-based voucher set aside for permanent supportive housing. Just like tenant-based vouchers, project-based vouchers are an integral aspect of keeping people housed by increasing the supply of affordable housing and preventing rents from rising. We look forward to continuing this conversation and are grateful to have a partner in the federal government as we work to address our housing and homelessness crisis. The communities that many of us here today represent, that many of us come from, can only be resilient if we dedicate the resources needed to move the needle and have honest conversations about equity. There is no going back to normal. Normal has not worked for Black and Brown and Indigenous communities. Normal has not worked for our unhoused communities. And this moment in time is unique like no other to lead in the change that we want to see. And I'm so honored and inspired to be here with all of you today and continue to do the work together. So thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Deputy Mayor Ramirez. It's so encouraging to hear how local leaders are guiding America toward economic recovery. I know our new market leader in Southern California, Jamar Wilson, is excited to continue to work with you and your team. Mayors and Chairwoman Danner, our attendees submitted many questions for all of you. But first, I'd like to turn to our guests from HUD to get their reactions. Up first, Mr. Jemison, what an honor to have the Principal Deputy Assistant Secretary with us today. We heard some common themes from our guests today, including the toll of COVID has taken on homeless populations and the challenges associated with housing the unsheltered during a pandemic. Can you tell us about HUD's plans to stem rising homelessness and rebuild communities?
Yes, well, thank you so much for that intro. I'm thrilled to be with you today and happy to provide some answers to that question. 15 months ago, when I was serving as the grantee in Detroit for HUD resources, I can assure you that I was doing some of the same things that the mayors on the call today were doing. Trying to decongregate shelter, making sure we could expand and get enough places with doors and bathrooms that we could actually help preserve life, and getting people access to at that time the testing that was so much needed. The landscape today is much different. today, as hopefully we continue to make progress on reducing the impact of the virus, we have unprecedented resources that have been made available through my office and as well as Dominique's and Treasury. $4 billion worth of ESG, $5 billion with the CDBG CV, the emergency vouchers that are being discussed that Dominique will talk about, as well as Treasury resources like the Emergency Rental Assistance Program, which is about $45 billion, and 25 and the home that's ARP that's $5 billion in and of itself. So the real challenge now, in my conversations with grantees, has been how do we weave these pieces together into one piece of fabric that represents the policy direction of the community. How do we bring all these different resources together to create the kind of housing that Mayor Tannehill or the kind of homelessness response that our LA partners have described? And I think the ways that we're proposing to do that are to get technical assistance and mobilize our field offices to work with grantees to think about how to bring those sources together. One example that's already been pointed out to by several local communities is using the state and local funds that come from Treasury that I haven't listed because they're not explicitly a housing resource, but many communities are saying, I'm going to get home funds soon, but I have state and local dollars today. They are much more numerous and have a much different regulatory regime than those home dollars. Is there a way for me to go and secure those motor inns or other facilities that may have been housing folks and turn them into permanent supportive housing with the home funds that are coming out? I might also highlight something that Dominique, I'm sure, will speak to, which is the potential to project base some of those new vouchers that we're hoping are passed in the budget, so that we can make sure that the units that are developed have the rental assistance necessary to make sure that they're truly available to the households, the people experiencing homelessness that we're trying to target. So I think the challenge is really how do we take the new resource landscape and sort of take each piece and create a quilt that's for the communities we're trying to serve. And we're going to provide technical assistance to do that. It's going to be technical assistance that's right for a big city, technical assistance that's also right for a smaller community. And we're going to be providing that both directly and in groups. So we're really thrilled about working with communities like the ones that have been mentioned here. One last thing we're going to do, this conversation today is such a great example of it, because it's the engagement with a local elected leadership makes such a difference in the ability to make goals. So we're going to be working with my colleague Richard Cho from the Secretary's office on an initiative that's going to use our sort of bully pulpit, quote unquote, to engage local leaders like the ones on this call, so that when we identify a numerical direction we want to go in terms of the production of permanent supportive housing and ELI, that we've got our mayors and local leaders driving that along with their allocatees, their grant makers, and their directors of housing and homelessness. So those are some of the ways we want to respond to some of the great ideas we're hearing on this call.
Well, thank you, Mr. Jemison. Scaling solutions, bringing resources to the communities that work. There's no one size that fits all. Very powerful notes from you. And given your impressive history and housing and community development in Detroit, we're expecting big and great things under your leadership. Thank you so much. Ms. Blum, as General Deputy Assistant Secretary for Public and Indian Housing, I'm curious to get your thoughts as well. One of the things that we heard today is that mayors need flexibility in being able to project-based more vouchers. What is your reaction and what are the Secretary's thoughts on the role project-based vouchers will play in any proposal to expand universal vouchers?
Thanks so much. Thank you so much to Enterprise for inviting HUD to participate. And this is my pleasure to be here with you this afternoon. With regard to expanding vouchers, what you see as part of the fiscal year 22 budget is the first step in radically expanding vouchers across this nation. We are seeking an additional 200,000 additional vouchers specifically for persons who are experiencing homelessness, as well as those that are fleeing domestic violence. This is our first step in, I think, a multi-step process to be able to have universal vouchers in the future. Why is this important? We know that housing is the cornerstone to security and stability. This is why we need to continue to expand our Housing Choice Voucher program. But vouchers can only go so far if you don't actually have affordable housing in cities and in towns. What we've heard in this panel, that the creation of affordable housing is ultimately what we need to seek as well. And vouchers can produce that affordable housing. As many of you know, housing authorities with their voucher assistance can use up to 20% of that for project basing. And today, we have about 260,000 project-based units that are across this country, with another 22,000 that are in production. This is almost double what the affordable housing resource of project-based vouchers that we had in 2016. So I know cities and towns are using this resources, but there is still more potential. For those housing authorities in cities that want to dedicate their vouchers to specific populations, including those that are experiencing homelessness, veterans, elderly, persons with disabilities, and the production of units in low poverty, high opportunity areas, housing authorities can go up to 30% of their housing choice vouchers. Again, providing more opportunities for these specific populations and being able to provide housing in high opportunity areas as another way to address segregation, affirmatively further fair housing, and address inequities. On top of all this, there is no cap for the production of project-based voucher units when housing authorities in cities are replacing public housing units, whether that's through our rental assistance demonstration program or producing replacement housing with vouchers, if it's replacement for public housing. So again, another tool, another way to create long-term affordable public housing across this country. Let me just say that there are two main, I think, thrusts and powerful ways that vouchers can be used. One, to be able to create supportive housing, right? To be able to provide housing that is full of services and supports for those that are elderly, those that have disabilities, and those that are homeless. This is a powerful tool. Secondly, it's a powerful tool for preservation and creation of housing. Right? I can't say that enough. Many of you already know that, but there is potential here. When I look across the country, I see that there are 97,000 vouchers that are not in use today. It means this is money sitting on the table across this country. Please use it. Housing authorities and cities use this resource. If there isn't affordable housing available to use these vouchers, produce housing. Use the ability of project-based vouchers to be able to create more affordable units in your neighborhoods, in your towns, in your cities. So with that, please utilize this resource. We know how important affordable housing is for creating equality and being able to address homelessness and to be able to continue to provide supports for elderly, disabled, and veterans. Thank you.
Well, thank you so much, Ms. Blum. I applaud you for your years of service at HUD and your commitment to improving public and Indian housing. With responses from HUD in mind, I'd like to bring our local leaders back on the screen for a few follow-up questions. We received hundreds of questions for this panel, but unfortunately we can't answer them all here, but there are some common themes we see. Mayor Hancock, we heard a lot today about public housing. Can you tell us how your personal experience living in public housing shaped your approach to protecting its residents?
Sorry, I was muted.
Yeah.
There we go. Actually, Jacqueline, I remember very clearly what it meant to be in a neighborhood that was perennially overlooked and neglected, where we couldn't even get, quite frankly, pizza delivered or a taxi to come through. I remember that being driven by the lack of investment and very intentional efforts to redline on a lot of things, whether it was insurance and access to jobs and good schools. But being in public housing, it's that experience that every time I sit down, we're talking about housing, I'm thinking about those families and what it takes to help to lift people out of situations, making sure they have good access to good transit, for example. Because I often say, if you want to know where poverty exists, look where there are the least amount of mobility options, and I'll show you where poverty exists. And so the ability to marry the cost of transportation or access to good transportation and decent housing should all be figured into whether or not a neighborhood is stabilized. And when we work with HUD, if I can just put this in here, building a good foundation locally in order to be innovative and to think outside the box, but bring the values that you celebrated Mayor Lightfoot for in terms of equity into the conversation. It's so extremely important as we deal with CDBG, we deal with home funds, and we deal with all the other efforts that HUD will implement. And so HUD working with cities and the ability to work directly with cities on these dollars, I think helps to deliver the real veracity of these services to the people and meeting them where they are, and to make sure that equity is driving it, because it's the local government leaders who are truly on the ground, work with folks and have a better sense of what people are dealing with every day.
Well, thank you so much for that, Mayor Hancock. And you know, when you share your story, lived experience is invaluable. Those that were trying to serve need a seat at the table. I heard it from Mayor Tannehill. I heard it from Mayor Lightfoot. People with lived expertise need to be at the table and help shape this along with our public agency partners. So thank you so much for sharing your experiences. Mayor Tannehill, the communities represented here today illustrate the broad spectrum of political ideologies mayors must face. How have you been able to find bipartisan agreement to make affordable housing happen in Oxford? What's your secret?
Well, as I think probably everyone on this call can agree, the politics of housing is messy unless we focus on the people, not the party. You know, when we decided to confront the affordable housing crisis in Oxford, the first thing that we did was bring people together in person, a diverse group of community stakeholders, and we focused on our shared core values and our mutual commitment to putting roofs over people's heads. We brought all people with goodwill to the table: Democrats, Republicans, Independents, people who could care less about politics, and people who, in my opinion, maybe care a little too much about politics. But we found that we shared a core value: serving people. And that's how we made it happen. We laid a strong foundation and we built on it. Now, friends, half a decade in, and after many community successes, let me share one of the most interesting results that we've seen. Although I'd run as a Democrat, it wasn't the Republicans who attacked our efforts as some effort to bring down the community. In Oxford, ironically, the most vicious attacks on our efforts were from the self-described progressives who in theory claim to support affordable housing, but in practice do nothing but attack our community's efforts as, quote, not enough. So this type of thinking is naive, and it actually hurts the very lower income residents that we are here to serve. Concentrating on face-to-face, mutually respectful and curious conversations works. And I'm proud to say that Oxford, Mississippi is proof of that.
Oh, hear, Mayor Tannehill. We like to see the inclusion, and I always say about the power of including people. On to my next question. Chairman Danner, as an elected Native leader serving trust lands established by the U.S. Congress, what are your thoughts for Secretary Fudge and her team to better advance housing prosperity for your constituents?
There's many places, but the one thing I would offer Secretary Fudge is I think that breaking down silos between divisions within the agency itself would be powerful. It's just no longer acceptable. It's no longer enough for the HUD Office of Native American Programs to be the go-to and the only area where solutions and good ideas are being debated, or the only area of HUD where understanding the basis of federal land trust is embraced. We really need to break it down, all the silos across, and we need our HUD officials to build partnerships, build places for us to be speaking, not just to ourselves and within trust land areas, but I mean, just today, I have learned so much from Mayor Lightfoot, from Mayor Tannehill. These are the kinds of conversations that we need to have. I'd like to see HUD eliminate the invisibility. One of my favorite comments that President Obama gave trust land leaders is that no citizen should be invisible to his government. By the way, we did raise a pretty good president there in Hawaii. Just got to say that. So we as First Americans, we are invisible. We're too invisible. We are the first Americans, 15,000 years of cultural knowledge about this country, 2,000 years out here. So I'm excited. I really think this is going to be the HUD secretary that breaks down those silos and is okay with having the difficult conversations among government leaders, cross-section, among different divisions at HUD. I'm really optimistic, and thank you so much.
Well, thank you, Chairwoman Danner. We go further together. So to your point, let's include everyone as we move America ahead. Mayor Lightfoot, how can HUD assist with decades-old public housing stock that may need a great deal of help in 2021 and beyond?
Well, let me pick up on the comment that was just made by Leader Danner, which is break down silos. We look at some of these legacy developments, and what we see is not just the need for affordable housing, we see the need for wraparound services. And that's where I think partnership with local leaders who are on the ground, seeing what residents need, and then coming together with HUD resources. I would say what you need in some of these instances is almost like a SWAT team, an interdisciplinary team that comes together, working with local leaders to really make sure that we're fulfilling the needs of residents. And you talked earlier with respect to Mayor Hancock, who I love and think is one of our brightest innovative leaders, bar none at any level. But you talked about the concept of lived experience, and that is so important. Our residents need to know that we see, hear, and respect their lived experience. And what HUD can do is not operate from a distance, but be there, be present in communities, understanding what the needs are, and then really motivating assets and information at the local level to make sure that we are reflecting the lived experience of our residents in the way in which we are crafting policies and interventions to really help them live the best possible, vibrant lives. And again, you can't do it alone. We can't do it alone. It's only through partnership, working together. There's not one size fits all solution, but we need to take the approach of breaking down silos and coming together. That's what we're doing here in Chicago. Every time we see a challenge, we take a whole of government approach. It's not just one agency or another, because what we see is every agency has something to bring to the table to help address and solve a problem. That's the approach that we're taking to summer violence this year in Chicago. So say a prayer for us as we need to say a prayer for cities across the country. But this is I think the way in which public policy and public service has to work going forward.
I couldn't agree more. The integration of federal, state, and local engagement on all these efforts is critical to success for all of us. So thank you so much, Mayor Lightfoot. Deputy Mayor Ramirez, could you briefly expand on the efforts Los Angeles is taking to keep residents from falling into homelessness after the pandemic?
Yeah, well, we know that tens of thousands of our low-income renters were already facing housing insecurity before the pandemic. And as COVID-19 has heightened the struggle for folks to stay housed. I saw that firsthand working in the nonprofit sector with our housing insecure families and seniors before this pandemic hit. Just as Mayor Tannehill shared earlier, we must continue to put people first. And that's been our approach here in Los Angeles. And our approach has been focused on three things: paying protections, rental assistance, and eviction prevention services. And we hope to continue them after the pandemic. However, with the unprecedented level of federal investment in rental assistance, it's still clear that the high-cost, high-poverty cities like Los Angeles are not going to have enough funds to fully support households. Renters will need additional help. We're going to need robust federal investments in longer-term rental assistance, as well as eviction defense and housing stability services. Here in LA, we're working with the county and community partners to launch a comprehensive eviction defense program, and we would welcome the opportunity to coordinate with HUD's Legal Services Demonstration and national efforts to improve eviction data collection. Ensuring tenants have the resources and support to exercise their rights and stay housed will be critical to a just recovery.
Well, thank you so much. I'm watching it firsthand. We need more resources. We have some good solutions. We need to just carry them to scale. So, and with that, thank you very much, Deputy Mayor Ramirez. It's time to wrap up. I know all of our participants and attendees join me in thanking all of you and our local leaders and senior HUD team for being here today to lay out a vision of how we can work together to take innovation to scale, strengthen partnerships in the coming months and years. Thank you so much. I feel renewed today. It's a good way to kick off a Monday and the beginning of a week. Thank you all so much. Flora, I'll turn it over to you to wrap things up. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacqueline. And thank you everyone for joining us today for this exciting discussion. As you all know, there's still much more to be done, but today in hearing from our local leaders and federal officials, I personally feel inspired knowing that they are at the helm, leading us into an equitable and promising recovery. Thanks again to everyone for joining us. Have a great day.